afternoon. My name is Dr. Sireen Hout. I'm a professor and currently the chair of the English department. And I will be giving you this afternoon the lecture on Edward Said's Orientalism. I have taught, of course, the text itself when I taught CS 204, which I did until actually only a year ago. And so it's a text as well as an author close to my heart, because he actually was my professor at Columbia University in the 1990s. Okay, I shall begin. You have a handout literally in your hands, so there's no need to project it onto the screen. You already have it in your hands, and I'm going to be following the Roman numerals pretty closely. So if you follow my handout, you should not get lost and therefore get the maximum out of this lecture. I will be referring in the course of the lecture to two specific and what I find fascinating paintings by Orientalist artists, and one of them is already projected onto the screen, and they are also part of your packet. Okay, so only those two will you actually be seeing on the big screen today. The rest is to be followed with your minds and hearts and handouts as well. Thank you. A classical pianist, an opera lover, a member of the Palestinian National Council between 1977 and 1991, a courageous defender of Palestinian human and political rights, a public figure with countless TV appearances, a much sought-after professor, a critic of literature, history, philosophy, the media, culture, music, the arts, and politics, a husband to a Lebanese woman, Mrs. Mariam Qortas, a father of two now grown-up children, and fortunately, as I just mentioned, my PhD advisor at Columbia Universities in the mid-1990s, Edward Wadi' Said is truly what might be termed a Renaissance man. Controversial in his multifaceted work, Edward Said had both admirers as well as detractors, if not downright political enemies. Those who loved him almost worshipped him and followed him, and those who hated him issued death threats, one of which I read when I was a student at Columbia, and called him a professor of terror in one of those post-it notes that was actually left on his office door. This was mainly because he was photographed in southern Lebanon at one point throwing a stone at an Israeli guardhouse, although he explained later in an interview that this gesture was purely symbolic and had not been aimed towards any particular individual. Columbia University in New York City, where he worked all his life, never bothered, of course, to take these slanderous statements seriously. Furthermore, as he liked to tell us in his classes, Harvard University tried to hire him on many occasions away from Columbia, but he loved the cosmopolitanism and the thriving cultural scene of New York, which he called the capital of the world, by the way, calling instead Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard is located, merely a small village in comparison to New York. Said was born to a wealthy Protestant family in Jerusalem on November 1st, 1935, when Palestine was at the time still under the British mandate. He spent much of his childhood, along with his four younger sisters, in Cairo, Egypt, sometimes traveling to Jerusalem to spend time with relatives, or to Beirut, Lebanon, during summer vacations. At the age of 14, he moved with his parents to the United States, where he obtained his BA from Princeton University in 1957 and his PhD from Harvard University in 1964. In 1977, Edward Said became a member of the PNC, or the Palestine National Council, the Palestinian National Council, which is a provisional government and parliament, I should say, not government, established with the goal of pursuing eventual Palestinian nationhood. He died, by the way, believing in the one-state solution, not the two-state solution, in case you are, read up on that. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with chronic leukemia, which he battled for 13 years of his life before succumbing to it on September 25, 2003, at the age of 68, in his own apartment in Manhattan. He is buried in Brumana, Lebanon, and you are welcome to go and visit his grave should you ever be in Brumana. I'm now at Roman numeral 2, where I will be discussing his works and his legacy. Edward Said has written hundreds of articles on various subjects and has authored, or occasionally also co-authored, well over 20 books, some of which, by the way, were published posthumously, meaning after he passed away. And their titles can be found anywhere on Wikipedia, on any website, Google Scholar. So there's no need for me to go through them by name. Perhaps I should only mention in particular the one that we're focusing on, Orientalism, which was published in 1978. Okay, and maybe just some other titles just to show you how the breadth of his scholarship. One of them is called The Question of Palestine. One was on purely music, called Musical Elaborations. One is called The Politics of Dispossession, about Palestinian dispossession. One was about Islam and how it's covered in the media, called Covering Islam. One was called Blaming the Victims. And one was actually his very PhD thesis was on Joseph Conrad and the fiction of autobiography. He's also written a seminal book on beginnings, intention, and method, and so on and so forth. Among the literary awards, and he received many, that he received in his last years was one for Lifetime Achievement Award. You know, the kind of stuff they do also at the Oscars, but we also do it in the world of intellect. And that was bestowed upon him by the Lennon Foundation in 2001, 2 years before he passed away. If you are interested in knowing more about the intricacies and, in fact, sometimes even glaring contradictions of his very eventful and productive life, I would recommend that you read his own autobiography. He wrote a memoir titled Out of Place, خارج المكان. It's been translated into many languages, one of which is Arabic, and that was published in 1999, 4 years before his demise. There's also a 138-minute documentary titled equally Out of Place, Memories of Edward Said, that was directed by the Japanese Sato Makoto in 2006, in fact, almost during the Israeli war on Lebanon in that summer. It was filmed in Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, and the United States, and as such traces Said's childhood influences and celebrates his intellectual legacy. Again, if you go to Google anytime soon, you will realize that even as I speak, more and more readers, introductions, sometimes even critical books are still coming out about his very plentiful and multifaceted work. Roman numeral 3 now, titled Major Literary Historical Events in the Orientalist Tradition. Before I talk to you today about the book, its significance, where it came from, where it was headed, how it was received, and so on and so forth, it's important to talk about what was happening in the 18th century before the onset of so-called Orientalism, as he defines it, beginning in 1798, or the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt in 1798. So what was happening in the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, as we call it, which is actually the subject matter mostly of CVSP 203, what was happening in the 18th century in terms of interest in the East that Edward Said deemed important and in fact necessary steps towards what he calls the onset of discourse of Orientalism starting in 1798. So there are 3 major events that I would like to highlight under A, B, and C in your handouts. One of them is the discovery, really, of European scholars of the Arabian Nights, or what we call Alf Layla wa Layla, or Les Mille et Une Nuits in French. And this is really accredited to Antoine Galland. Antoine Galland was a French Arabist. He spoke Arabic fluently. He came to Lebanon and Syria. At the time, it was actually all called Syria, more or less. There was, of course, always Mount Lebanon. The word Lebanon is mentioned in the Bible, as you may know. But it was pretty much all one country, referred to as the Levant in most sort of Orientalist travel journeys at the time. He basically came to compile those stories, which, as you know, were oral in nature before they were written down, pretty much like Gilgamesh, I suppose, and certainly like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were, for the longest time, oral stories handed down from generation to generation, literally from mouth to ear, and then so on and so forth, before they were compiled as written texts. He did that between 1704 and 1717. And he translated it back into French. He, of course, delivered a sanitized version, because the original Arabian Nights, in fact, if you ever lay your hands on them, are something to savor. They are extremely sort of pragmatic, pornographic, in fact, in many parts of them, describing things that you wouldn't even begin to imagine. But he delivered sort of like a bourgeois, if you like, sort of like cut version of that in French between 1704 and 1717. And following the French translation, just about every other language in Europe, grabbed those stories and rendered them into various vernaculars. So why is that important? It's important because it opened up Europe to a whole new world, first of all, that fired up their imagination about all kinds of, forbidden and exotic places. And exoticism and Orientalism, according to Edward Said, of course, do go hand in hand for many of those fabulists. Orientalists are not necessarily only fabulists; they could be actually, colonels on the ground giving orders for people to be executed in Egypt or the Sudan. But nonetheless, they are all Orientalists in a certain sense that I will come to describe later. But second, Sanskrit is a very important discovery. Why? Because until 1786, when William Jones, who is actually a British man, discovered it, the European world had thought mistakenly that Hebrew was in fact, اللغة العبرية يعني, which is of course a Semitic language, the Arabic, was the oldest language in the world. And their whole pride was based on the fact that, of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition is based on Hebrew. But when Sanskrit was proven philologically, grammatically, semantically, orthographically, to have predated Hebrew, this sort of took Europe by surprise when they realized, interesting, we need to look even further east than, say, the Holy Land in order to look for the origins of civilization. So it was an eye-opener. Also, I should mention perhaps here that until the 18th century, most Orientalists were biblical scholars. They were mostly interested in languages, say Arabic, Hebrew, and they were also interested in the Quran, that which must be read. As you know, that's what Quran means. And of course, there was a flourishing activity in terms of translation at the time happening of the Quran, of the hadith as well, into various vernaculars. So there was already sort of a vested interest on an intellectual level, but also, of course, soon on the pragmatic sort of boots on the ground level within the colonial enterprise in the East. 1832 is an interesting date because in it a man by the name of Edgar Quinet, he was French, coined the term Oriental Renaissance. When we talk about the Renaissance today, we think of Florence, Italy. That would be CVSP, I think, end of CVSP 202, right? When you read Machiavelli's The Prince, and when you think of Michelangelo and Raphael and all of those great authors and artists, that defined pretty much the cradle of European Renaissance. So the Oriental Renaissance is in reference to another rebirth, but this time not of the classical texts from the Greco-Roman period, but rather of the regions that lie both to the east and to the south of the European continent. Now I will move on to the book itself, which is what you are reading this week, or of course you're reading, I assume, only excerpts of that much larger book. Well over 200 pages, by discussing first what I call its intellectual inheritance. Nothing comes from nothing, right? That's actually the title of a song, Sound of Music. If the name of the movie means anything to any of you, nothing comes from nothing, right? I mean, certainly materialists would agree with that. Nothing comes from nothing. So Edward Said's even own genius, of course, is credited to people who came before him, right? I mean, nothing is ever, from scratch. And Edward Said himself would actually admit and, in fact, credit two particular authors to whom he owes a lot of intellectual gratitude. And they are Michel Foucault, who was a French 20th century a theorist, but also the Italian political activist and theorist Antonio Gramsci. I have chosen these two because they are the ones that actually use terms and deployed, if you like, on the horizon concepts that he mobilized and sort of used very, very interestingly and sometimes in an inflected way in his own book. So first, Michel Foucault. What did he sort of inherit intellectually from Michel Foucault that he deemed important and necessary almost as an infrastructure, as an intellectual infrastructure sort of for his own work? Michel Foucault emphasized the notion that knowledge is always political. And when I say political, I don't necessarily mean political with an uppercase P. It could be with a lowercase p, as in nothing is entirely innocent. No knowledge is really entirely innocuous, because knowledge as such, unless used, doesn't really have a practical value, right? I mean, if a book is on the shelf that somebody has written and died and no one will ever read again, does this book really exist? This is, of course, a philosophical question. But so basically, once knowledge is used, according to Foucault, it has already been politicized in one form or another. Another notion, sort of derivative notion of that, is that power, according to Foucault, is always exercised rather than possessed, even if in very subtle ways. Everything around us has already been sort of linked to certain discourses, sometimes opposing ones, even if in invisible ways. So power is not localized. Power always infiltrates, according to Foucault, every aspect of our life in any given moment and time period and in any particular given discourse. Foucault also stressed the notion that Edward Said basically jumped, to grab, is the notion that there's always a strong relationship between power and knowledge production, both in scholarly activities as well as in popular thinking. In other words, once I know about something, I possess it more. But once I possess it more, I'm in a better position to generate even greater knowledge about it. So it's what I called sort of like the snowball effect. It's a dialectical relationship between knowledge and power. One leads to the other, and once you have more of the other, you have more of the first, and so on and so forth. It's a dialectical relationship. In terms of Gramsci, the Italian theorist activist who spent time in jail, actually, for his political beliefs, Edward Said mostly borrowed his notion of hegemony. Hegemony in Arabic is al-haymana. It's a word that we hear every day on the news, in reference usually to various, if you like, world powers. Basically, it means domination, right? And it is instrumental as a notion in understanding the cultural pervasiveness of Orientalist constructs and representations in Western scholarship and reporting. So the Orient appears then, more often than not, as the ultimate other of Europe. This is a very important notion that I will use to lead on to sort of more intricate concepts used in an interrelated manner in his book. Let's begin with the most basic thing. Europe came to define itself, according to Edward Said, as the exact opposite of the Orient. Let me just say very quickly that the Orient is not just the Orient as we might define it today, يعني le Moyen-Orient, as the French would say, or the Near East, which is of course a biblical term. The Middle East is a political term that Israel created so that it can be included. That's why the Middle East is used today, but it's actually the Near East. There is no mention of the Middle East in the Bible. When Edward Said uses the word Orient, he means pretty much everything lying to the east of Europe. That means all the way, not only Western Asia where we live, but all the way to Far Asia, including Japan and the Fiji Islands, right? And of course the entire African continent. So everything that lies to the east and or to the south of Western geography and biopolitics and also consciousness and psyche is deemed the Orient. Okay. The word other or al-akhar has been very popular for the last, I would say, 20 years or so. Now, if you look it up in the dictionary, now you can even use it as a verb. I am othering you. to other someone is now actually a verb and not only a noun. And I would like to mention in this regard, Youssef Chahine, of course, the famous former, late, I should say, not former, the late Egyptian filmmaker, made a movie called Al-Akhar in 1999 that shows you how popular the term had already become by the end of the 20th century. Okay, now I'm on to B, which is about the book's progeny. First, I talked about the legacy, what he inherited from the book, for the book. And now I'm going to switch to talk about what the book, what kind of tone it set for future thinkers, future, if you like, critics, and what kind of importance it constituted in 1978 when it was first published in English. Orientalism, the book, that is, the book, has been extremely influential, but also controversial in post-colonial studies, which it inaugurated pretty much when it first appeared in 78. It was groundbreaking and very inspirational. So much so that two post-colonial critics have said, quote, even Native Americans, Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and other colonized peoples, الشعوب المضطهدة, right? Or المستعمرة, and oppressed groups located in this book called Orientalism, not only a spirit, but even a methodology to challenge a chronic tendency of the West, the Western powers, to deny, suppress, and distort native cultures and histories, end of quote. So this book, Orientalism, has been translated into well over 40 languages. This was at the time I prepared this lecture, which was already some years ago, probably over 60 languages by now. In Arabic, it's called Al-Istishraq, if you want to read it in Arabic. Okay, so Said explained in several interviews and TV appearances that he conceived of this book, of the notion of the seed, of the embryonic notion for this book in the wake of the 1967 war. I don't know how much you know about Arab history. In 1967, it's considered a Naksa, right? And Egypt was dealt a major blow by Western allies and Israel, of course. So much so that he actually proposed to step down as president of Egypt at the time, but it was turned down, and he remained president until he died in 1970. So in that year, it was seen as a major defeat for Arabs, a Naksa of 1967. So Edward Said says that he was living in the US at the time, as a US citizen, mind you. Yet, in the wake of that war, many people approaching him, even on the street, started really looking at him in hostile terms as an Arab, more than even as an Arab American. And this made him think, gee, I might have well seen myself as a dual citizen, but others insist on seeing me and pigeonholing me as something else, or as something that they came to sort of blame for many ills of the West. So he explained in an interview, quote, much of the personal investment, his own personal investment in this study derives from, he says, my awareness of being myself an Oriental as a child growing up in two British colonies. One was Palestine and the other Egypt. So what does Said really mean by the term Orientalism? Now we're getting to the meat and potatoes, to use an American expression, of the lecture. Orientalism is a discourse. Discourse in Arabic means al-khitab, not khutbah, such as the one I'm giving now, not speech, but rather discourse, khitab. Orientalism is a discourse encompassing a constellation, according to Edward Said. I'm using a cosmological term from Hawking almost. Allah yarhamu kaman. The last man sitting is now dead in CVSP 204. Okay, so according to him, Orientalism is a discourse encompassing a constellation of false assumptions, prejudices, and stereotypes underlying Western, Christian, white, and middle-class, entity that insists on seeing all that is non-bourgeois, non-white, non-Christian in inferior terms. This is very important. Specifically, this body of scholarship, according to him, began to flourish, this is very important, in a systematic, discursive manner, hence the term discourse. Discursive is the adjective of the noun. Beginning in 1798, when Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte, before he became emperor, actually, he became emperor in 1802, I think, or 1804. In 1798, of course, following the French Revolution, he came with several ships. He arrived in Egypt, but Edward Said sees much more than that. Sees much more than a political expedition in that. He sees a whole way of trying to now dominate the non-West, in this case Egypt and the Sudan. They were pretty much one country at the time, and to benefit from them in cultural, political, militaristic, and also economic terms. This is very important. In fact, for Edward Said, those all are mutually reinforcing activities by the West. But I will explain this a little bit more later on. So according to Edward Said then, soon following this expedition, essentialized and very crude, reductive, as opposed to complex and multifaceted caricatures started already developing about especially Muslims and non-Arab Muslims in particular. And of course, you are only all too aware as a younger generation of the constant, every once in a while we hear in the news about yet another Western artist having produced, what we see in this part of the world, what many of us see in this part of the world, as sort of belittling, if not downright insulting, say, images of Prophet Muhammad or as-Sahaba or. But this is not new. What I'm here to tell you, and what Edward Said is here to tell you through me, is that this is not new. Okay, the West has a big part of the West, I should say, has always thrived on maligning, on putting us down. All that they deem as being non-European, non-Christian, non-white, and what have you. I do have to mention, though, at this point, and again, more examples might be found since I prepared this lecture, that because your generation watches movies perhaps more than others, there are some movies that you might think of to think about. You might think about as to whether they actually possibly try to deconstruct this binary that Edward Said as being always operative between a superior West and an inferior East. Some examples that might come to mind is the movie Syriana with the George Clooney that was released in 2005, The Kingdom, 2007, Rendition, 2007, Black Gold, of course in reference to oil, 2011, and others. In the next section, I will try my best to come up with some connections or parallels that I see existing between this book, Nietzsche, Freud, and Mann. Are you still reading all three? Are you still reading Mann or no? You are? Okay, if you are, then I will refer to Mann as well, because I know that Freud and Nietzsche are still very much present. But if Mann is still present, I will also make references to Death in Venice, that is, by Thomas Mann. So, this deeply entrenched tradition of inaccurate images and statements, mostly about the Middle East and Africa, in Western culture, according to Edward Said, has served as a justification for the imperial projects undertaken by European, but also the American rising empire in the region. The US rose, in that sense, to being an empire, in his opinion, albeit not in direct terms, following the end of World War II and the demise of Hitler. Said argues that in the Western mind, the Orient and the Occident stand in contrast with one another, and as oppositional terms, in the mind of the West, that is, where the Orient is always construed as the lower image of the West. So from a Nietzschean perspective, you read Beyond Good and Evil, if I'm not mistaken, and in that book, from an epistemological perspective, Nietzsche talked about the pair of antithetical entities, how, and he locates the error in Plato, if I remember correctly, that Plato is he's the father, I can't say the mother, of all errors, because he basically basically established what he calls idealist philosophy, right? Or what came to be called idealist philosophy, where you have one pair in which one has a foreground valuation compared to its neighboring attribute. For example, man is always superior to woman. He's not, but this is the common perception, as Simone de Beauvoir will tell you soon, right? The West is superior to the East. Plato would say the mind is superior to, of course, the appetites. Christianity came, Islam came only to tell you that this life is nothing compared to the afterlife. The afterlife is more important than this life. So this kind of dichotomous thinking is interesting to use in order to understand what Edward Said sees as a common mistake, of course, a happy mistake, actually, for them anyways, that the West has always sort of exercised over and against the East. So if the West is progressive, that's because the East is backwards. If the West is clean, that's because we live in squalor. If they are democratic, that's because we are despotic regimes, and so on and so forth. So Europe came to define itself this way. Instead of scratching my ear this way, it came to scratch its left ear this way. It is not what it claims to be. It is not in terms of, it is what it's not. In other words, it is not despotic. It is not unclean, it is not backwards, because those are the attributes of the inferior East. So it came to define itself as the opposite counter-image of Europe. And that, of course, is, according to Nietzsche, a very wrong approach to take to understanding the world, and this, in a way, sort of corroborates Nietzsche's view of its falsity. Edward Said reminds us that the Orient, quote, came to be Orientalized. You might say, what do you mean the Orient is Orientalized? It's already there. No, it came to be exaggerated in its difference from the East, because they had no interest in emphasizing similarities. They had big interest in defining dissimilarities in order to justify the white man's burden, to use Kipling's term. They wanted to come and conquer and divide, with some kind of a justification, which started in the 19th century with the rise of fake sciences like phrenology and what have you, that basically justify that biologically the African man, say, is, according to some wacko scientists back then, by definition, cranially speaking, inferior. Therefore, they should be happy we are there to rescue them from their own destitution, intellectual and economic. Of course, all of which is bunk. Okay, so as Europe's counter-image, I would now turn to Freud, away from Nietzsche now, but to Freud, and invoke Freudian terminology, which I take over from the book that you have read, which is Civilization and Its Discontents. And Edward Said, Sigmund Freud had talked about the unconscious. Remember, the unconscious is there. It may not be empirically verifiable, but it's there. It resurfaces in dreams and in Freudian slips and what have you. And it's suppressed, but it always comes back to sort of haunt you or bite you. And it is the place of Eros and Thanatos. Remember the pleasure principle? We're all born with a certain fixed amount of psyche based on the conservation principle. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's merely transformed. And therefore, it is the locus of Eros and Thanatos, our impulsive lives surrounding death and surrounding pleasure. So the East, therefore, in a way, could be seen as the place where the European collective, erotic, but also aggressive impulses can be exercised away from the censorship of European urban centers. In other words, the East was where people went literally and or figuratively, mind you, because a lot of them were armchair travelers, meaning their butts never left their seats, but they were there fantasizing about the Orient. But it's always the place where you can get away with things, go to and get away with things, including, say, homoerotic or even homosexual practices, because, hey, who's there to watch you? Who's there to censor you? It's the place of forbidden desires to be finally released. This is what the East came to represent for many in their collective mind. And therefore, Freud is actually interesting in thinking about the East as a place of unrepressed, but also a place where such repressed materials can actually be released without consequences, with impunity, that is. Okay, so the Orient becomes saturated with images of sexual lasciviousness. And now, in this vein, I would like to draw your attention, for example, to this painting here. This was done by a European painter. I don't know who it is at the moment. It's irrelevant because some were better than others in quality. For example, Eugène Delacroix was an absolute master of color and strokes and what have you. But thematically, Edward Said would say, infrastructurally, if you look deep, not only at, but through the painting, there's a difference between looking at and through something, you will see connected behaviors. In this painting, basically what you see is an Arab youngish man on the left side of the painting, and he already has his mistress half naked lying next to him. And what do you see on the left side of the painting? Anyone? What is the old man supposed to do? What is he bringing in? Another potential slave for sale, obviously, and she's fully naked. Again, even if this happened, and we do know that Arabs were slave-owning societies. I'm not saying they were not. Of course they were. Most societies were. So were the Greek societies that produced supposedly the first democracies in the world. It's unlikely that this ever took place. I mean, she would have had some piece of clothing on her. And the old man is just seen as this, is projected rather, as this extremely sort of like, the man who just wants to seal the deal, so to speak, right? Of course, any person who is not very well acquainted with this part of the world is going to think, oh, all Arabs are like that. They're oversexed, and money buys everything, or can buy anything. So, and unfortunately, many of those paintings revolved is the word I'm looking for, around such, allegations of extreme sort of sexual promiscuity and what have you. Now, this picture is my favorite. Okay, this is a picture that is not cropped. It is as is. And in it, you have an artistic portrayal of a hammam, or a public bath for women. Of course, women went to different baths from those designated for men. And you have two women, again, one, half naked, both of them. And you have this sort of shadowy figure clad in black, and the head is cut off. Okay, now presumably this person will have to be a woman, because only women can enter into such private women's spaces. And this person is holding, is that a hookah? Is that an nargile? Okay, right. Pleasure has to be, of course, maximized here. Now this, again, it's unlikely that somebody, even a slave, would be either a eunuch in this particular case. You know what a eunuch is, right? A man who has been demanned or unmanned, biologically speaking, and or a woman like them who would also be in such high temperatures. I know it's not a sauna, it's a bath, but nonetheless. So this is a very unlikely scenario. My point is this: this person could easily be what the author or the painter in this case would like to be. He, in all likelihood, this was painted by a male European painter, would like to be inside the picture, which means he would like to be inside the hammam. Okay, do you see what I mean? Yani, if you look at this painting from a symbolic sort of meta, a critical level, you could say that this person could well represent the author's innermost and perhaps suppressed desire, speaking of Freud again, to be inside the painting, and therefore the only way for him to be inside such a space that is only open, of course, to women. Only European women were allowed in such spaces, but not men. Anyway, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but hey, life is all about interpretation. Remember Nietzsche? There are no facts, there are only interpretations. So I'm being Nietzschean. All right. So basically, the Orient became saturated, in short, with many, many images of this kind of sexual lasciviousness. Other examples would include belly dancers, and would include all kinds of public baths, nude boys. On the original cover of the book, I don't have it with me, you see a boy with a cobra around him inside of a mosque, which has weapons in it. None of which is historically accurate, none of which could have ever taken place in such an amalgamation, I would say, of superimposed desires. So in some way also, and in reference now to Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, you could also say that the Orient is the Venice of Europe, pretty much. I mean, Gustav von Aschenbach, at the age of 50, bored stiff with his life as a scholar, went there in order to experience life. And he fell in love with a 14-year-old boy. That's what falling in love is really supposed to be all about. It's not planned, right? And he realized how repressed he had been all his life, and how unhappy, in fact, he had been, and how truly uncreative he had been also, decorated as he may have been. He had not exercised in his art any pure energy. It was all Apollonian, as opposed to Dionysian and Apollonian, which again, according to Nietzsche, only would approximate a perfect version of art. So again, to what extent, you might ask yourselves, is the Orient another version of Venice? Okay, just a few other examples, or quotations rather. Benjamin Disraeli was is a former prime minister, like Theresa May now, and he had said, he was also, by the way, a novelist, and he had said in one of his books, The East is a career. So the East is a place to do everything, including having a career. And so the main actors in Orientalism became, as I said, the French and the British cultures and empires, from the beginning of the 19th century all the way till the end of World War II, and since World War II, as I said earlier, the rise of the US empire. In short, in insisting on seeing and consequently representing the Orient not as it is, as in the real Orient, as he would say, but rather as they would like it to be, and not only to be, but to remain. The eternal present, we don't have a trajectory. The East basks in an eternal present where there's no defined past and no defined future, but only an eternal present. This is why Edward Said says, and I'm quoting from the book, the Orient is less a place than a topos. It is less an actual place than an image, a fixed, wrong image or metaphor in the Western mind. Not so much defined by history and geography, but rather by the West's own obsessions and own desires and own ambitions with high stakes in that part of the world, where they can exercise fantasies, desires, and taboos. All right, so some major definitions now of Orientalist discourse, and I'm now looking at letter D, okay? Main definitions, it's on your handout, of Orientalist discourse. So what is Orientalism then? He would say it's a style of thought based upon an ontological difference, what they see as an ontological difference, and also an epistemological distinction between the West superior and the East inferior. It's also a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. That's enough in terms of major definitions. Now, what is the structure? This is important. What is the structure? Now that we have had a definition of the discourse called Orientalism, how does it function? How does it operate? And Edward Said would say, well, I'm now looking at letter E, capital E. It's not there. It was never there. Okay. He would say Orientalism is divided into 3 components. This is important. This is the second batch of the meat and potatoes of this lecture. And all of them are mutually reinforcing entities. One of them is academic. The other is imaginative. And the third is historical. Basically, all this means is that the academic branch basically means that throughout the centuries, there have always been people in the West who have been really academically, genuinely interested in the Quran, in the languages we have, in the literary oeuvres that we have produced. Academic interests, fine. We all agree that this has happened. Imaginative, of the kind we have seen here, but also travelogues. It's not just artistic. It could also be verbal fantasies, right? And the third is the historical material, as in having been there to colonize it. Edward Said says, and this is the important part, is that these 3 components are not separate from one another. This is very important. They actually reinforce one another. The academic, the imaginative, and the historical material are 3 branches of the self-same discourse that nourishes itself via those 3 tentacles, if you like. Well, now it sounds like an octopus, but if you know what I mean. And each of those tentacles brings back something to the main body of the octopus, but they reap things in different ways. But ultimately, the octopus is growing, okay? Second, as far as structure is concerned, he says that Orientalism has 2 main facets. Aspects. One he calls latent. Again, this is a term he adopts from Freud, and the other is manifest, which he also adopts from Freud, because Freud, in his interpretation of dreams, published in 1900, had written that dreams that dreams are made up of 2 levels. One is latent, which is an undercurrent, doctrinal, unchanging, but not easy to see. And the other one is the manifest. It's what you remember at 5 in the morning because your alarm clock happened to go off. It doesn't mean that this is what your dream is actually about. This is only the surface of the dream thought that caused you to have those images in your dream. But anyway, that's another discussion. Some people don't believe in any dream interpretation at all. Suffice it to say, Edward Said borrowed these 2 terms because he liked Freud. I know he did. He said that in class many times. And he basically applied them to Orientalist knowledge. Basically what he argues is that No matter what product you look at, whether it is an Orientalist painting of the sort you just saw, or a letter written, say, by Herbert Kitchener, one of the most sort of savage colonial administrators that you will ever come across, or whether you look at, what do I know, a surrealistic or imagistic poem by Théophile Gautier around the turn of the 20th century, sitting on the Bosphorus, which is the major river running through Istanbul, and talking about the beautiful colors of the rising dawn. According to Edward Said, and this might be a bit of a stretch, that if you look at all of these artifacts, they are all Orientalist in the sense that they might seem very different on the outside, they might seem very different on the surface of things, because one is a poem, one is a novel, one is a letter, and they belong to different genres, and they have different contents. He would say yes, but contents and genre are surface matters. But when you look through these documents or artifacts, according to him, what you would come out with is a sense of continuation of the same overriding sense and sort of privilege of being superior to the East. So don't be fooled, he would say, by manifest differences, because on a doctrinal level, on an infrastructural level, no matter how different they are on the surface, they are unchanging because of a certain unconscious desire and, in fact, view of oneself as being superior to that which is being represented or supposedly represented. Okay, so no matter how different the manifest aspect is, the ideological infrastructure remains the same based on superiority over the East. So the internal consistency then of all of these artifacts, according to him, is a very strong glue. Again, remember the snowball effect I started off at the beginning of the lecture? Right. The more they know about the East, the more they can accrue information about it. The more they accrue information about it, the better they can dominate it, and so on and so forth. So according to Edward Said then, the Orientalist authors, thinkers, writers, philosophers, travelers, real or not, fabulists, they all look at the East from a certain perspective, and according to him, and this is very important, they were much more interested in how they refer to one another in terms of citations, in terms of quotations, in terms of either approving or disapproving of their predecessors, as they were, in his opinion, about the actual East. Hence, the cohesiveness of the body called Orientalist scholarship and art is by far stronger than any correspondence between the subject and the object. The coherence is larger than the correspondence. Okay, so two more things. He talks about two more concepts. One he calls a strategic exteriority. Okay, again, this is not necessarily true, but he says that these Westerners saw themselves as being superior precisely because they deemed themselves outside of their objects of study, hence, therefore, objective about what they were talking about. So that's what strategic location means. They see themselves as being outside of their topics, of their media, of their products, and therefore authoritative enough and objective enough, although I just tried to show you that in fact the exact opposite might be happening, albeit on a more subliminal level. And strategic formation basically means this glue that I talked about already. Okay, to sum up, he would say Orientalism overall is not an empirical tradition, although some, of course, have risen to contravene this opinion, by the way. That according to him, however, it is very anti-empirical because it is unexistential and it's very citationary in nature. Orientalism is a textual thing. Even if they came to live amongst us, they never really, according to him, tried or even were interested in having a genuine dialogue. Hence, it was basically always a discourse of domination. Okay. This is this summary of his view of the book. Reception, I will only say a few things. This book, of course, was very, very positively reviewed, as I said earlier, by post-colonial critics. He, in fact, sort of inaugurated the whole field of post-colonial theory and practice. Of course, some were against him. The Neo-Saadians, did take many aspects of what he believed was true, but of course did sort of say that he might have gone a little bit further here and there, or that he sometimes came up with sweeping generalizations about the West of the kind that he was criticizing in the first place, that he himself was sweeping when he said that they had sweeping generalizations about the West. Some people talked about how he did not, for example, focus more on the gender difference, say between women coming from France to a hammam versus men coming from France to a hammam, and that Europe also has other internal others that are deemed inferior, like the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, even in the English context, and not only the Arabs, and so on and so forth. Others said that he did not emphasize as much elements of class and race and gender, as I said, or even age, and that he was a little bit too, formalizing, and a little bit too hegemonic himself, perhaps, or monolithic himself, perhaps, in his approach to the Orient. Conclusion. This book was written in 1978. This seems like already a zillion years ago. But of course, today we live in an age in which, that didn't exist when the book was produced, which is the digital age, right? Now we talk about being in a post-national global age where we can be connected to one another in a matter of seconds through the internet. So the question is perhaps that you might want to ask yourselves or raise in the classroom, to what extent has this immediacy also caused perhaps an emotional immediacy between you and potential others, as opposed to in the past when it did take more time to actually meet others in order to change your opinion about them or not. And also, again, hypothetically, if you had the chance yourselves at this age and this time and age to actually try to be someone else, to imagine yourself, who would your ultimate other be? Like even standing on the balcony tonight of your apartments or houses, like if you looked outside and thought about it for a second, who in this world would seem to you right now as being the exact opposite of who you are in financial terms, economic terms, skin color terms, linguistic ones, and what have you. And then ask yourself, what would I do if I were able to put myself in that person's shoes for 24 hours? What would I imagine their lives as being, and how would perhaps that hypothetical exercise help me in reviewing my own values that I had before I imagined myself in that other person's shoes, your ultimate other? Thank you very much.